This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 11. The Lord Jesus Christ has appeared many times so far in this book. In chapter 2, he was Yahweh, whose house will be established in the latter days on the highest of the mountains, on Zion, unto whom the nations will stream, who will cause men to beat their swords into plowshares, and will cause panic on the earth in the day of his appearing in the glory of his majesty. In chapter 4, he's the beautiful and glorious branch of Yahweh who will create in that day a canopy of glory over Zion and over all her assemblies, a canopy of cloud by day and fire by night. In chapter 5, he's the well-beloved of Yahweh who owns the vineyard, which is the house of Israel and Judah, who doesn't receive his due from them. In chapter 6, he's the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, whose train fills the temple, about whom the seraphim call, Holy, holy, holy. In chapter 7, he's the child who eats butter and honey, who refuses the evil and chooses the good. In chapter 8, he's the waters of Shiloah that flow softly, and at the same time he's the destructive flood waters of the river. He's also the one who says, Behold, I and the children whom Yahweh has given me are for signs and wonders. We didn't teach on that at the time, but it's a double reference to Isaiah and his son Maher-shalal-hash-baz, and to Christ and the sons and daughters he'll adopt into the kingdom. Christ is a wonder, and his bringing of us into the kingdom is a sign and wonder. In chapter 9, he's the child who's born and son who's given, who will bear the government on his shoulder, and will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace, whose government will increase to no end on David's throne to establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness forever. In chapter 10, he's the light of Israel and the fire that devours the thorns and briars, who'll consume all the vainglory of man. Now here in chapter 11, your narrator can't bear to break it up, so we'll read it all 16 verses, then comment. Verse 1. A shoot will come out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots will bear fruit. Yahweh's Spirit will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Yahweh. His delight will be in the fear of Yahweh. He will not judge by the sight of his eyes, neither decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he'll judge the poor, and decide with equity for the humble of the earth. He'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he'll kill the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his waist. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, the calf, the young lion, and the fattened calf together. A little child will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze. Their young ones will lie down together. The lion will eat straw with the ox. The nursing child will play near the cobra's hole, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They'll not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. It will happen in that day that the nations will seek the root of Jesse, who stands as a banner of the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. It will happen in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant that's left of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. He'll set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy also of Ephraim will depart, and those who persecute Judah will be cut off. Ephraim won't envy Judah, and Judah won't persecute Ephraim. They'll fly down on the shoulders of the Philistines on the west. Together they'll plunder the children of the east. They'll extend their power over Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon will obey them. Yahweh will utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his scorching wind he'll wave his hand over the river, and will split it into 7 streams, and cause men to march over in sandals. There'll be a highway for the remnant that's left of his people from Assyria, like there was for Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. Comment, that's the chapter. In verse 1, a shoot will come out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots will bear fruit. If we visualize the Messiah's family tree, Jesse's the root of it in verse 1, David was his son, then somewhere out on that tree past David, as a branch of it, Yahweh said a forever king would emerge, 2 Samuel 7:12 and 13. That makes the forever king a branch from the stock of Jesse, as verse 1 put it. This explains why the prophets sometimes call the Messiah the branch, Isaiah 4:2 and 11:1, Jeremiah 23:5, Zechariah 3:8 and 6:12. Anytime the prophets call him that, it's a reference to his family tree. But the branch isn't the terminal part of the tree in verse 1. There's something even further out. The branch bears fruit, it says. The fruit is every believer. We're the fruit of the branch, which is the Messiah. So if we believe, our family tree goes directly to the Messiah, which is the branch, and on back to David, Jesse, and further we know from biblical genealogies to Jacob, known as Israel, then Abraham, Adam, and who was it that fathered Adam? None other than God. Those are some of the highlights of our family tree. But speaking of the Messiah in verse 2, Yahweh's Spirit will rest on him. It's a spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and the fear of Yahweh. The Messiah will have all that. In verse 3, the Messiah will particularly delight in the fear of Yahweh. In verse 3, the Messiah will not judge by the sight of his eyes or by the hearing of his ears. Why should he, since the eyes and ears can give the wrong impression, and the Spirit of God, which he has, doesn't? In verse 4, as a sign of his righteousness, he'll decide with equity for the poor and humble of the earth. The dynamic of the present age is that money talks and rule is by boastful pride. The Messiah won't play by those rules, yet he'll exercise power. In verse 4, he'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips kill the wicked. Revelation 19:15 is an echo of it, that in his appearing on a white horse out of heaven, quote, out of his mouth proceeds a sharp double-edged sword, that with it he should strike the nations, end quote. He wields his power by speaking. In verse 5, righteousness and faithfulness are the belt of his waist, meaning those qualities are central to him. Then there's the peace he'll impose in verses 6 to 9. After he strikes his enemies, he'll impose peace. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, the calf with the young lion. Not even the fatted calf is a temptation to the young lion in verse 6, and a little child will lead them. Concerning any particular student of prophecy, depending on his general view of prophecy, the general interpretive framework under which he operates, the piece of verses 6 to 9 is either a description of the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, that's the framework in which your narrator operates, or as some take it, is something less literal. It's just in general terms that the Messiah delivers peace, a sort of can't we all just get along and coexist type of mentality. But to your narrator, God's fulfillments aren't in shades of gray or in general tendencies or in partialities, but in absolutes that would never be possible in the world as we currently know it. The prophecies, as your narrator reads them, are a description of a world completely different from the way it is now. After 2,000 years of Christianity on the earth, we haven't come close to the all-encompassing worldwide peace that's described in millennial prophecy, and your narrator doesn't expect that we'll ever achieve it short of the personal return of Jesus to Zion. Granted, there's already peace in believing hearts, a sort of individual peace in this person here and that one there, but there's not the all-encompassing peace across the world described in multiple prophecies. So your narrator believes in a coming age wherein the Messiah will reign directly in person to completely fulfill these prophecies, not just that he'll fulfill them in a partial way in this age. That grand peace won't prevail until the Messiah appears personally, destroys the wicked with the sword of his mouth, and establishes his direct rule, as your narrator sees it. Then in verses 7 and 9, there are more signs that this is a peace that would be impossible in this age. The cow and bear won't prey on other animals. They'll eat grass instead. The nursing child will play by the cobra's hole. They won't hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. Your narrator prays for the knowledge of Yahweh to cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, and he works for it daily to bring it to pass in this present age, but he doesn't expect it to happen in the fullness the prophets described it until an age to come. In verse 10, in that day the nations will seek the root of Jesse. Now hold on, Jesse was the root in verse 1, and now we're talking about Jesse coming from a root himself. It turns out the Messiah is the unseen root of Jesse here in verse 10, as well as being the branch out there on the visible end in verse 1. There's emphasis on Jesus being on both ends of the family tree in Revelation 22:16. Jesus says there, quote, "I am the root and offspring of David," end quote, which means Jesus gave rise to David and David gave rise to him. Another way of saying it is that since Jesus is God, he created David, and since Jesus was descended from David, David gave rise to him. He's the root and offspring of David. In verse 10, the nations will seek the root of Jesse in that day, the nations being the Gentiles of the earth, and the root of Jesse being Jesus. The nations will seek Jesus, is what that's saying. The Messiah's resting place will be glorious in verse 10. As Isaiah has already described, his resting place will be his temple in Zion, elevated above the surrounding topography of that day, all covered by a canopy of cloud by day and fire by night. In verses 10 to 12, the Messiah will set his hand again a second time to gather Israel from the four corners of the earth. A second time. That's interesting. From history, there's been a first time, which was the gathering from Babylonian captivity, and now we've witnessed in modern history that God gathered Israel a second time in 1948. Modern Israel is a sign and wonder. Israel's been gathered a second time. Biblical prophecy is playing out before our eyes. The specific mention of the nations in verse 11 is only a partial list from which God will gather his remnant. We know because in verse 12, the second gathering will be from the four corners of the earth. Concerning verse 13, in Isaiah's time, Ephraim was part of Samaria, and they were hostile to Judah, but in the coming day, the hostilities between the tribes of Israel will be a thing of the past. There will be no more envying among them. In verse 14, Israel will dominate the nations in that day, from the nations to the east, which means as far to the east as their known world extended at the time, to the Philistines on the west, to the nearby Edom, Moab, and Ammon. So Israel will have nothing to worry about from the nations near or far. In verse 15, Yahweh will utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his scorching wind he'll wave his hand over the river and will split it into 7 streams, and cause men to march over in sandals, also translated march over dry shod, without getting their feet wet. It's an allusion to Mosaic times when God blew on the waters of the Red Sea and parted the sea with that wind. Yahweh will deliver Israel a second time, the prophecy is saying, in a similar way. He'll blow and split the waters into 7 streams. In Moses' time, there was only one dry path, but in the second gathering, take your pick of 7. The point being God will bring Israel back to the land from wherever they are, not just from Egypt, and he'll do it even more powerfully than in Mosaic times. He'll bring them back 7 ways. We might express it 7 ways from Sunday, all kinds of ways, one way or other. And verse 16 is the last verse, quote, "There will be a highway for the remnant that's left of God's people," end quote. The use of God's people there, rather than just Israel or Judah, leaves it open that what we've been reading might be a double prophecy that speaks not only of the second gathering which started in 1948, which is only Israel in the flesh, but in the millennium it'll be a gathering of believers from every nation. Because going back to verse 10, he'll set up a banner for the peoples, the banner being a thing to rally around, to draw people in, and all peoples being the various Gentile nations. And again in verse 11, it applies to his people from the various nations. And again in verse 12, he sets up a banner for the nations. This gathering would be a holy nation drawn from every nation to one banner in Zion. So when we read Isaiah 11, we have to keep in mind the 1948 second gathering of Israel of the flesh and a millennial gathering of believers of all nations. Now, someone might say that the current Israel of the flesh isn't really Israel because in large part they don't recognize the Messiah. Your narrator would point out that in the first gathering from Babylon, there were a lot of non-believers in that too. Isaiah 12 is next.